Hey everyone, settle in tonight as we journey into the mind of one of history's most complex figures. Not the Napoleon you see in paintings astride white horses, but the man who lay awake at night, haunted by voices, whispering that he wasn't enough, would never be enough, could never stop proving himself. Because the moment he did, the whole glittering empire might reveal itself for what it truly was. A desperate construction built on foundations of fear. Before we begin this exploration, if you enjoy these deep dives into historical psychology, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And as always, drop your city and current time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from Tokyo at dawn or London at midnight. All of us drawn to understand what drove this extraordinary, troubled man. Now, dim the lights, find your comfortable spot, and let's ease into the hidden chambers of Napoleon Bonaparte's psyche, where the real conquests and defeats took place long before any battlefield saw his shadow. Picture Paris in late 1795. The air still carries the metallic scent of revolution, that peculiar mixture of blood and possibility. Through the doorways of elegant salons where yesterday's aristocrats once waltzed, today's survivors gather nervously, dressed in revealing fashions that scandalize the old guard. Among them moves a woman named Rose, soon to be known as Josephine, her practiced smile concealing debts and a recently saved neck. The guillotine had spared her only 5 days before Robespierre himself fell to its blade. And there, watching her from across the room with an intensity that bordered on hunger, stood a thin young general. 26 years old, awkward in social situations, his uniform hanging somewhat oddly on a frame that would never be called imposing. Napoleon Bonaparte had already shown military brilliance at Toulon, but in this salon, surrounded by sophisticated Parisians who moved through conversations like dancers, he felt every inch the Corsican outsider he'd always been. When he looked at Josephine, 6 years his senior, he saw everything he wasn't: aristocratic, socially adept, sexually experienced, connected to the right people. He needed her to validate him, to prove he belonged, to silence the voices that had whispered since childhood that he was different, lesser, not quite French enough to matter. This moment encapsulates Napoleon's entire story. Not the campaigns, not the legal reforms, not the empire stretching from Spain to Poland. No, his real story begins earlier, in the fears that would drive every conquest, every crown, every desperate attempt to build something so vast and undeniable that no one could ever again make him feel small. Let's travel back to August 15th, 1769, to an island caught between identities. Corsica, recently conquered by France, still bleeding from resistance. The Bonaparte family claimed noble lineage, ancient Tuscan roots, transplanted to this Mediterranean rock. But nobility without wealth is a peculiar curse. Napoleon's father, Carlo, made a precarious living as a lawyer, 8 children to feed. Ambitions constantly scraped against the ceiling of his means. The timing of Napoleon's birth carries its own irony. Just 3 months earlier, France had officially absorbed Corsica. He was born French by the slimmest margin, yet this accident of timing would define his internal conflicts. Imagine growing up torn between two identities. In Corsica, the Bonaparte family represented the collaborators, those who'd bent the knee to French occupation. Young Napoleon heard whispers about his father's accommodation with the conquerors, saw how resistance fighters viewed families like his with suspicion. Yet when Carlo secured passage for young Napoleon to French military school, the boy discovered he wasn't French enough for the French either. He arrived at the military school at Brienne in April 1779, barely 10 years old, carrying his Corsican accent like visible luggage. The other boys heard it immediately. That slight difference in pronunciation, the way certain words emerged from his throat marked by Mediterranean cadences. They mocked him relentlessly. The Corsican, they called him, never bothering to hide their disdain. France, after all, had just conquered his homeland. He was the enemy's son, tolerated but never embraced. Napoleon withdrew into himself, building walls that would last a lifetime. School reports described him as reserved, hard-working, egotistical, and extremely ambitious. That word, egotistical, barely scratches the surface. What those teachers witnessed was a child constructing elaborate psychological fortifications, learning that if you can't be loved, you can at least be undeniable. He threw himself into his studies with ferocious intensity, particularly mathematics and military strategy. Here, finally, was a realm where his Corsican accent didn't matter, where being an outsider couldn't diminish the purity of a correct answer. But even his excellence carried the bitter taste of compensation. He wasn't studying for love of learning. He was studying to become someone those French boys couldn't dismiss. Every correct answer whispered back at the voices saying he didn't belong. His father's death in February 1785 compounded everything. Carlo left only debts. Napoleon, still finishing his military education, suddenly bore responsibility for his mother and 7 siblings. The pressure must have been extraordinary. Not yet 16 years old, mourning a father he'd barely known, now expected to be the family patriarch, while his peers worried about nothing more serious than the next leave period. This financial terror would never leave him. Even at the height of his power, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, Napoleon hoarded gold, demanded tribute, extracted every possible franc from conquered territories. The child who'd lain awake, worrying how to feed, his family still lived inside the emperor. Let's pause here and consider how these early experiences shaped everything that followed. Napoleon's childhood taught him several brutal lessons. First, that he would always be an outsider, always need to prove his right to exist in spaces that didn't want him. Second, that money meant security, and its absence meant terror. Third, that social acceptance would forever remain just beyond his reach, no matter his achievements. These weren't abstract philosophical concerns. They were visceral, cellular fears that drove his every decision for the next 4 decades. Move forward to that revolutionary Paris where we began, where young General Bonaparte encountered worlds that terrified him more than any battlefield. Money and sex, the twin anxieties that paralyzed him even as his military star rose. The Directory period was a fever dream of speculation and hedonism. People who'd been nobody yesterday were suddenly rich today through clever property deals, buying confiscated estates of guillotined nobles. Napoleon found this world simultaneously fascinating and repulsive. He tried his hand at speculation, dealing in smuggled luxuries like coffee, sugar, silk stockings. He hated himself for it, despised the men of business, even as he became one, briefly. But the lessons stuck. Money meant power, and power meant safety. Then there was the other problem, the one that left him even more disoriented. Sex. In revolutionary Paris, the old moral codes had collapsed. Women moved through society with unprecedented freedom, their dresses scandalously revealing, their affairs openly discussed. For a young man who'd spent his adolescence in military schools, this landscape was bewildering. He'd had almost no experience with women. School reports suggest he was socially awkward, unable to engage in the flirtatious banter that Paris society demanded. When other officers traded war stories and bedroom conquests, Napoleon had only his books and ambitions. This is where Josephine enters, and where one of history's most consequential relationships begins. When Napoleon met Rose de Beauharnais at that salon in late 1795, he was emotionally starved and psychologically vulnerable. She represented everything he lacked: aristocratic bearing, sexual confidence, social sophistication, connections to powerful people. He fell catastrophically in love. Within months, he proposed. She, practical and calculating, saw security in this rising general, even if she found him physically unattractive and socially awkward. She reportedly told friends he was silent and awkward with women, and altogether strange in all his person. Not exactly a ringing endorsement. They married in March 1796 in a hasty civil ceremony. 2 days later, Napoleon left to command the French army in Italy. And here begins the most psychologically revealing chapter of his life. From Italy, he wrote letters that still make readers uncomfortable with their raw neediness. "I awake full of you," he wrote in December 1795. "Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses." He poured out his soul on paper, hundreds of letters declaring love with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Josephine, meanwhile, wrote back rarely and coldly when she did. Napoleon noticed. "I am not satisfied with your last letter. It is cold as friendship," he complained. Cold as friendship. The phrase contains universes of hurt. Here was Napoleon, brilliant military commander, winning battle after battle, bringing glory to France, and his wife couldn't be bothered to match his emotional temperature. It must have felt like school all over again, like every moment when he'd reached out for acceptance and received indifference. Then came the confirmation of his worst fears. By June 1796, Josephine had rejoined Napoleon in Italy, but with a companion, Hippolyte Charles, a dashing 23-year-old hussar lieutenant. The affair was obvious to everyone except Napoleon initially, but when he visited her Milan apartment in November and found it empty, suspicious finally bloomed into terrible certainty. The British intercepted a letter about the affair and published it widely to embarrass Napoleon. The humiliation was complete and public. His response reveals everything about his psychology. He wrote to Josephine, "I don't love you anymore. On the contrary, I detest you. You are a vile, mean, beastly slut. You don't write to me at all. You don't love your husband." The rage in those words still burns across centuries. But then, astonishingly, the same letter ends. "Soon, I hope, I will be holding you in my arms. Then I will cover you with 1,000,000 hot kisses, burning like the equator." Love and hate, desire and rage, all tangled together, because beneath both emotions lived the same crushing fear. Abandonment. Josephine's betrayal activated every childhood trauma, every moment of rejection, every instance of being made to feel not good enough. He'd opened himself completely to another human being for perhaps the first time in his life, and she'd treated his vulnerability with casual disregard. The lesson was clear and permanent. Never be that vulnerable again. Napoleon considered divorce but couldn't go through with it. Instead, he transformed the pain into policy. After his conquest of Egypt in 1799, he began taking lovers openly, publicly, almost performatively. Not for pleasure, but for revenge and control. When he later caught Josephine with a lover, he forced her to listen to detailed descriptions of his own sexual conquests, demanding she applaud his prowess. If she showed hurt, he grew vicious, reminding her she'd been unfaithful first. By his logic, she deserved every moment of payback for humiliating him before the entire world. This pattern, established with Josephine, extended to his governance. The man who couldn't control his wife's fidelity became obsessed with controlling everything else. The Code Napoleon, his famous legal reforms, enshrined remarkably restrictive views on women's rights and sexuality. Women needed control, he believed, because women had the power to destroy men emotionally. His sexual insecurity and distrust of women, historians note, hampered his diplomatic relations. He saw negotiations as showdowns where he had to win, where any concession represented weakness, emasculation. He could never see that tactical retreats might serve strategic advantages. His fear of appearing weak in negotiations, combined with his determination to extract maximum tribute from defeated enemies, meant every treaty he made left the other side hungry for revenge. Consider the deeper implications. Napoleon's inability to trust, born from Josephine's betrayal, fundamentally shaped European politics. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810, after finally divorcing Josephine, was explicitly designed to gain legitimacy by marrying into old European royalty. He referred to his new father-in-law as family, thrilled to marry someone related to Marie Antoinette. But this desperate grasping at aristocratic legitimacy revealed another fear that had driven him since seizing power: the terror of being seen as illegitimate. The coup of Etienne Brumaire in November 1799 made Napoleon first consul, effectively ruler of France. But on what authority? Not bloodline, not democratic election, really. Force, timing, and popular will, certainly, but these felt unstable to Napoleon. He'd watched Louis XVI fail precisely because the king showed weakness. Napoleon learned that lesson. Strength must never waver, never admit doubt, never show the vulnerable human beneath the uniform. But this created an exhausting psychological trap. If your legitimacy rests on appearing invincible, you can never stop conquering, never admit weakness, never rest. This fear of illegitimacy manifested in countless ways. He crowned himself emperor in 1804, placing the crown on his own head in Notre Dame Cathedral because he couldn't bear to have even the Pope appear to grant him authority. He created elaborate imperial symbolism, the eagles, the bees, the purple robes, all designed to make his rule look ancient and inevitable rather than sudden and grasped. He put his brothers on thrones across Europe, not just from nepotism, but to create a Bonaparte dynasty that looked eternal, not improvised. But Napoleon knew the truth, and it tormented him. The old aristocracies of Europe, the families who'd ruled for centuries, they looked at him and saw a Corsican upstart, a revolutionary general in fancy dress playing at emperor. They might bow, they might call him sire, but behind closed doors, they mocked him. The British press particularly infuriated him. Cartoonists like James Gilray depicted him as a tiny, ridiculous figure, inventing the myth that he was unusually short when he was actually average height for his time. These cartoons struck deep because they exposed his real fear, that underneath the imperial grandeur, he remained that awkward Corsican boy, forever outside, forever performing belonging he never felt. This hypersensitivity to criticism drove him to censor the French press ruthlessly. He eliminated dissenting voices in the legislative assemblies. He couldn't tolerate mockery because mockery exposed the performance, reminded him that his legitimacy was constructed, not inherited. Every criticism whispered that perhaps he didn't really belong after all, that his crown was just a very expensive piece of theatre. The fear of illegitimacy connected directly to another terror, being forgotten. Napoleon understood, perhaps better than most rulers, that power is performative and memory is selective. What would people remember about him? A brilliant general, yes, but would that be enough? Military glory fades. Today's hero becomes tomorrow's footnote. This fear drove him to reforms that would outlast battles. The Code Napoleon, the standardization of French law, was explicitly designed to be permanent, unchangeable, his permanent mark on civilization. When he met Goethe in 1808, he made sure to display his literary and scientific knowledge, impressing the great writer with discourse on every subject from music to mathematics. He wanted to be remembered as a Renaissance man, not just a warrior. But here's the cruel paradox. The more Napoleon tried to secure his legacy through conquest, the more he guaranteed his eventual downfall. Each victory demanded a greater one. Each peace treaty felt like stagnation, an opportunity for enemies to rebuild while his legitimacy eroded through inaction. He couldn't stop, because stopping meant facing the question. Without war, without victory, who was Napoleon Bonaparte? The question terrified him because he didn't know the answer. This brings us to Russia, to the decision that destroyed everything. In 1812, Napoleon stood at the apex of his power. He controlled most of Europe. He'd married into Austrian royalty. His son had been born the previous year, securing his dynasty. By any rational measure, this was the moment to consolidate, to govern wisely, to let his empire settle into permanence. His advisors urged exactly this. The invasion of Russia was madness, they argued. The logistics alone were nightmarish. Russia's vast distances would swallow his army. But Napoleon couldn't hear them because their advice required something impossible: admitting limitations. To understand the Russian campaign, you must understand that it wasn't really about punishing Tsar Alexander for leaving the continental system, though that was the stated reason. It was about Napoleon's inner demons demanding that he prove he could do the impossible. Russia was the unconquerable, the vast frozen challenge that previous European powers had wisely avoided. If Napoleon could defeat Russia, march to Moscow, and dictate terms, then surely his legitimacy would be unquestionable. Surely then, the old aristocracies would accept him. Surely then, he could stop proving himself. He assembled the Grande Armée, 600,000 men from across his empire, the largest European army ever gathered to that point. Walking through the encampments, you would have heard French, German, Italian, Polish, and a dozen other languages. A true European force, theoretically unstoppable. Napoleon was gambling everything on one premise: that Russian generals would fight and lose according to the customs of early 19th century warfare, that defeated armies would surrender, that Alexander would sue for peace after battlefield defeats. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Alexander and his commanders understood Napoleon's psychology better than Napoleon understood theirs. They knew he needed that decisive battle, needed to force terms, needed to return to Paris with unambiguous victory. So they denied him. They retreated. They burned their own villages and crops, implementing scorched earth tactics that left Napoleon's army with nothing to forage. They fought when necessary, bloodily, but never decisively. At Borodino in September 1812, 70,000 men from both sides were killed or wounded in a single day. The French held the field at day's end, technically a victory, but the Russian army withdrew in good order, denying Napoleon the decisive surrender he desperately needed. Then Napoleon made his worst mistake. He marched to Moscow and occupied a burning city. The Russians had set it aflame rather than to let him enjoy triumphant entry. For weeks, Napoleon waited in Moscow's ruins, expecting Alexander's surrender, the peace terms, the validation. It never came. The Tsar simply refused to acknowledge defeat. This broke something in Napoleon's strategic thinking. He'd never encountered an enemy who wouldn't play by the rules, who'd rather destroy everything than submit. Finally, far too late, Napoleon ordered retreat in October. The Russian winter was just beginning. What followed was apocalyptic. Lacking food, warm clothing, and constantly harassed by Cossacks and peasants who picked off stragglers, the Grande Armée disintegrated. Men froze to death by the thousands. Horses died first, leaving artillery and supplies abandoned in snowdrifts. Discipline collapsed. Of 600,000 men who'd crossed into Russia, perhaps 100,000 returned. Napoleon himself abandoned his army in December, racing back to Paris in a sled because a coup threatened. He'd left his soldiers to die twice now, first in Egypt, now in Russia, always prioritizing his political survival over their lives. The Russian campaign revealed Napoleon's fundamental psychological failure. His inability to retreat or negotiate stemmed from childhood wounds, from that Corsican boy who learned you can never show weakness because the French boys are always watching, ready to mock. A secure leader could have withdrawn from Moscow immediately, could have made the best of a bad situation, could have preserved his army to fight another day. But Napoleon couldn't, because retreat felt like admitting he was what he'd always feared. Not good enough, not invincible, just another ambitious man who'd overreached. His ego, built on foundations of childhood inadequacy, preferred losing 500,000 men to admitting limitations. After Russia, everything unraveled quickly. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Prussia and Austria, seeing French weakness, joined Russia. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813 crushed Napoleon's new army. The Allies invaded France, captured Paris. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated, exiled to Elba. His brief return in 1815, the 100 days ending at Waterloo, reads like a man unable to accept an ending, unable to simply retire and write memoirs. He had to try once more, driven by those same fears that had always driven him. His second exile to Saint Helena must have been his personal hell. Imagine it, the man who'd controlled an empire, who'd moved armies across continents with a gesture, now confined to a tiny rock in the South Atlantic. 10 miles by 5 miles, surrounded by ocean, impossible to escape. The British weren't taking chances this time. They stationed ships around the island. They assigned Governor Hudson Lowe to watch him, a man whose explicit orders were to ensure Napoleon never escaped and to refuse him any imperial dignities. Lowe wouldn't call him Emperor Napoleon, not even General Bonaparte, just Napoleon Bonaparte, deleting even the U from Bonaparte, forcing him to acknowledge his humble Corsican origins. His correspondence was opened and read. His movements were restricted. British officers had to see him physically multiple times each day to confirm his presence. Napoleon, who'd spent his life controlling everything, could control nothing. His response was pathetic and heartbreaking. He closed the shutters of Longwood House, carving tiny peepholes so he could look out without being seen. He had servants dig sunken pathways in the garden to hide his movements. He preserved imperial protocol in his household with everyone in military dress and jeweled gowns, maintaining the theater of royalty for an audience of exiled companions and bored guards. He dictated his memoirs obsessively, trying to control his narrative, to ensure history would remember him as he wished, rather than as a failed dictator who'd brought misery to millions. His health declined rapidly. The isolation, the humidity, the lack of exercise, all took their toll. By February 1821, Napoleon knew death approached. He reconciled with the Catholic Church, after a tumultuous relationship that had included kidnapping the Pope. He made confession, took final sacraments. On May 5th, 1821, at 5:49 in the evening, Napoleon Bonaparte died at age 51. His last words, reported by those present, were, "France, the army, the head of the army, Josephine." Think about that. At life's end, stripped of empire and crown, facing the void, what filled his mind? France, the nation that had never fully accepted him, but that he'd served and shaped. The army, the instrument of his glory and terror. And Josephine, the woman who'd betrayed him, whom he'd divorced for reasons of state, but who'd remained in his heart. Not Marie-Louise, his empress and mother of his heir. Josephine, the relationship that taught him he couldn't trust, couldn't be vulnerable, couldn't ever lower his guard. 7 years earlier, Josephine herself had died at Malmaison. News of Napoleon's exile to Elba had reached her in April 1814, leaving her heartbroken, according to witnesses. She died in May. Her last words reportedly, "Bonaparte, Elba, the King of Rome." They died thinking of each other. These two people who'd caused each other such pain, whose dysfunctional relationship had rippled across Europe in the form of legal codes restricting women's rights and diplomatic negotiations that allowed no compromise. What can we take from this story? Napoleon's inner fears shaped not just his life, but the lives of millions. His childhood inadequacies, his social anxieties, his sexual insecurities, his terror of illegitimacy, his fear of being forgotten. These personal demons drove decisions that redrew maps, toppled governments, and killed hundreds of thousands. The boy who felt like an outsider at French military school became the man who had to control all of Europe to feel safe. The young general, humiliated by his wife's infidelity, became the emperor who saw all negotiations as battles he couldn't afford to lose. The leader desperate for aristocratic acceptance became the conqueror who could never stop conquering because stopping meant facing the emptiness at his core. There's something deeply human and deeply tragic in Napoleon's story. He possessed extraordinary intelligence, genuine military genius, administrative brilliance. He reformed legal codes, modernized nations, spread Enlightenment ideals across a continent. But all of it was driven by wounds that never healed, fears that no amount of glory could silence. He spent his life trying to prove he was enough, building mountains of evidence through conquest and reform. But the verdict always eluded him because it had to come from within, and the child who'd been mocked at Brienne never learned to accept himself. This is why Napoleon's story matters today. We live in an era of powerful people driven by inner demons, of leaders whose childhood wounds shape policy, of men and women who mistake conquest for healing. Napoleon teaches us that external achievement can't resolve internal conflict, that trying to silence fear through power only amplifies it, that the most dangerous leaders are often those trying to compensate for feeling powerless in childhood. His tragedy was that he had the intelligence to understand this, but not the emotional capacity to change it. The irony is that Napoleon achieved something close to what he wanted. We remember him. 2 centuries after his death, tourists visit his tomb at Les Invalides. Millions know his name. Students study his campaigns. His legal codes still influence law across Europe and beyond. But this remembered Napoleon is more complex than the hero he wanted to be. We remember the brilliance and the brutality, the reforms and the rivers of blood, the genius and the tragic flaws. We remember him as fully human, which might be the one thing he never wanted to be seen as. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider Napoleon's lesson, that the empires we build to protect ourselves from childhood fears become prisons of a different kind. That validation sought through conquest is never found. That the real battles worth fighting are the internal ones, with compassion for the wounded child who still lives inside us all. Napoleon never won that battle. Perhaps we can. Before you go, if this exploration resonated with you, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. These deep dives into historical psychology take considerable research, and your support makes them possible. Share your thoughts in the comments about what drives the powerful people in your own life, or your own experiences with the relationship between fear and ambition. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, the greatest victories are the ones that require no enemy.